You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guests today, Philip and William Taubman. They wrote a book, and I've been doing some Vietnam podcasts, history podcasts lately, mostly because of the kindness of Brian Vandermark, but I got sent this book in the mail. It was completely unsolicited, and Kyle Radler sent it to me, and I just simply couldn't put it down. The book is titled McNamara At War, A New History. Do you mind if I say Philip and William? Because I don't want to keep saying Mr. Taubman and not know who's who.
You can go one step further. Call me Phil.
And me, Bill.
It's titled A New History. Phil, why is it new? What in it is new?
Well, there are two elements of what's new. One are a set of documents that previous biographers of McNamara and historians who've looked at the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and goodness knows there are many books that have been written about all of the above. But Bill and I had the good fortune to get access to some new material. One of the new documents was a secret diary that was kept in 1966 and 67 by John McNaughton, who was the top Vietnam policy aide at the Pentagon to Robert McNamara. And in that diary, he describes in detail his conversations with McNamara and their joint efforts involving the war. And what it shows, and we can get back to this in detail if you like, is just how much they were both opponents of the war while they were waging the war in Vietnam. Another set of documents are a set of letters that Jacqueline Kennedy sent over the years to Robert McNamara that demonstrate a very close relationship between the two of them that extended through the Kennedy-Johnson administrations and well beyond. And those letters, I think, they certainly shed light on the fact that there was a close relationship, but they also shed light on Jackie's perception of McNamara as a peacemaker, not a warrior, as a peacemaker, and a man who wanted to end the Vietnam War even as he was in charge of it. And then, we had access to outtakes, literally, in the case of Errol Morris, who did the documentary The Fog of War. He gave us transcripts of all of his interviews with McNamara. And so there are new documents. And then the other dimension of what's new, I think, is that Bill and I have painted a portrait of McNamara as a man leading two lives, a double life, as a proponent of the war in the inner councils of the Johnson administration and as an opponent of the war among his friends, including Jackie Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy.
Bill?
Well, Phil has really covered the ground. The only other thing I would say is that the picture that we were able to extract from the new material shows the contrast with the traditional view of McNamara. McNamara, as described, for example, by Senator Barry Goldwater, was a computer with legs. He was cold, impersonal, technocratic, not very sympathetic or empathetic. Well, we discovered a man who was warm and emotional and passionate with all of the good and bad consequences of attitudes like that.
His views of the war certainly came into greater focus when he wrote in retrospect, and you two do a terrific job in sort of discussing that process, and we'll get to that later. And I don't want to skip over his time in Ford or World War II or any of that stuff, but really it's the war, the Vietnam War we want to discuss. But how wrong, you mentioned reasons why Goldwater was incorrect, but is he really that wrong in the sense that it seemed that McNamara wasn't a man of letters, but a man of numbers? Am I being too harsh?
No, I don't think so. I mean, he was, as Phil said, he led a double life. He presented himself to the world as cold and harsh and tough and unsympathetic and unempathetic. That's the way he presented himself. And we discovered the other side of him that was hidden. And what he did reflected both sides of himself. That is, on the one hand, he managed this war in which tens of thousands of Americans died and millions of Vietnamese. And he kept coming home from trips to Vietnam to claim that the war was going wonderfully well, great progress, and all the rest. But meanwhile, unseen by the world was the other side of him, in which he decided the war was unwinnable militarily. And he concluded what he really wanted to do was to end it. He told in April 1966, he confided to John McNaughton, his friend at the Pentagon. His words were almost exactly like this. He said, "I want to bring the boys home so badly that I can barely stand it." My goodness, to just think that the man who is managing the war and appears to be a kind of war hawk, secretly thinking that thought that he just expressed, that I described him expressing to John McNaughton in April '66.
Phil, the book spends some time talking about sort of the formative years of Bob McNamara. Could you take a minute or two or sort of like sum up his personality, his upbringing, what a remarkable, brain he was. No one's ever accused Bob or Robert McNamara of being stupid. That's for sure.
He was brilliant. When you go back and look at those years, you see he was the standout student in his high school in the Bay Area, a top student, very top student at UC Berkeley, enrolled into Phi Beta Kappa as a junior, just one of two or three juniors who got that honor in a class of over 3,000 students. When he went on to Harvard Business School, he was a top student there. So there's no question that he was intellectually brilliant. He grew up in a family with a very distant and aloof father, which ironically was the nature of his fathering his children. Robert McNamara's mother was meddling in his life constantly and encouraging him to be a superstar academically, and that didn't stop in grade school or high school or college. It extended on through his time at Harvard Business School. So the man that came out of those years, who ended up, moving on into a role in World War II in statistical control at the Army Air Corps, dealing with numbers, which was his forte. The man who came up through those decades was a striver, a man aiming for success in the most, extreme kind of definition of success, and had been largely successful. I think what many people missed who've written about him before is that even in those formative years, he was also a man under incredible self-induced stress. Partly, I think, because, when you set your standards so high, it's stressful trying to make the grade, but it's also, I think, a reflection of a sense of insecurity, a lack of self-confidence under that exterior, that icy exterior.
Was it important? You mentioned Harvard Business School and then sort of the double life. Was it important to Secretary McNamara to keep his credibility in the Georgetown set, the Harvard Yard set? And is that one of the reasons why you think he led this double life?
Well, I think that one of the ironies of all this is that if you take the two sides of him, the cold, ruthless, brilliant, number crunching side was both there, inherent in him, and of course encouraged by his parents, but it was also a kind of cover for his softer side, because he didn't want his softer side to be noticed. That is, he was trading on his rough exterior. That was what was bringing him promotions all the way up to the top and keeping him at the top. That the other side, for a man like that, was incriminating. It could be used against him. We turned out he was a lover of poetry. He kept an album of poetry. And when you look at the poems, you discover often sentiments of the kind that he was feeling, but didn't want personally to express. So the poetry was a kind of secret repository of ideas that McNamara held, but didn't want the world to know about him.
Phil, you mentioned his World War II service. Did that help him starting in 1961 when he becomes Secretary of Defense, or does it hurt him, or is it immaterial?
Well, no, I think it is material up to a point. So he made a name for himself in stat control, which was this large unit that was created within the Army Air Corps. During World War II, the United States Air Force had not yet been created as a separate service. And in World War II, there was a high demand for information about the condition of the planes that we were flying. There was a high demand for bomb damage assessments, dropping bombs on Germany, Japan, how much damage were they doing? And McNamara was a star in that unit. In fact, he got involved in helping General Curtis LeMay plan the firebombing raids on Tokyo. And so I think he came out of World War II probably more convinced than ever of the value of data and statistics. So now, and he relied heavily on data at Ford, but let's go to the Pentagon years. He becomes secretary in January 61, and the job immediately in front of him, the job that JFK wanted him to do, I think equally important to any kind of preparation to wage the Cold War. The job that Kennedy asked him to do was to reorganize the Pentagon, to get civilian control of the military services, which up until then had basically dictated budgets at the Pentagon. And he did that brilliantly. And so the data-driven Robert McNamara, the organizational man, the technocrat, all of that served him very well in the Kennedy administration. Then we get to Vietnam. Vietnam began under Kennedy, but the war in earnest for America began in the Johnson administration. And there he was betrayed by data. He was betrayed by either deliberately cooked data coming out of Saigon or misleading, unintentionally misleading data, whatever you want to say about it. It proved to be highly inaccurate about the state of the war. And so initially, he thought they were doing okay in Vietnam, and then he recognized that was not the case.
How did Secretary McNamara, it's interesting in reading your book and talking about getting civilian control back of the Pentagon. All I could help to think was, well, the previous 8 years, you had a 5-star general who outranked everybody, not only as commander-in-chief, but did while he was serving. How much of a change did Kennedy and McNamara implement from the Eisenhower years?
Bill can jump in with the with the what he did at the Pentagon. But I want to add a side note that's interesting vis-a-vis Eisenhower, whom you've alluded to. So I think what I'm about to tell you tells you a lot about Eisenhower's very sophisticated understanding of the Pentagon and what about the Pentagon did and did not work. So when the United States in the mid-1950s, blind to the realities of the actual Soviet threat, because we didn't know exactly how many missiles they had, how many intercontinental bombers they had. It was Eisenhower who approved the project to build the U-2 spy plane, which was a very exotic aircraft. And it was Eisenhower who, a few years later, approved the project to build the first spy satellites, photo reconnaissance satellites, that could take photos inside the Soviet Union, so we would really know what the Soviet threat looked like. And in deciding to move ahead with those two critical programs, he decided they could not be handled by the Pentagon because he thought the Pentagon was too conventional in its thinking, too hidebound in the Air Force's love of bombers and jets rather than exotic spy planes. So he turned those projects over to the CIA.
Bill?
The upshot of this for us is that when McNamara becomes Secretary of Defense, this powerful, brilliant man is actually rather insecure because he's had not only the Pentagon put in his basket, but in effect, he is playing a role defining American foreign policy. But in those early months, something happens that involves the so-called missile gap, which is that the United States learns from spy satellites that actually the gap is not in the Soviet Union's favor, but in our favor. And it turns out we're way ahead of the Soviet Union. Well, McNamara is having an early press conference with the Pentagon newsmen who cover the Pentagon, and he's asked about the missile gap, and he reveals the secret that we're ahead and the Russians are behind. And this was a highly kept secret. But when he reveals it, and therefore when he reveals it, the newsmen in the room get up and run out to report this. And it turns out to be a scandal. What the hell has he done? So it shows his ignorance, his inexperience. But when he goes to Kennedy and says, look, I've done a terrible thing and you should feel free to fire me, Kennedy reassures him, pats him on the head and says, I make mistakes too. And this is one of the reasons McNamara comes to love John Kennedy, which is not the way he necessarily feels about Lyndon Johnson after that terrible assassination.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends. Our guest today, who's the older brother?
I am by 6.5 years.
We'll start with Bill then. Bill Taubman is the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst College. His book, Khrushchev, The Man and His Era, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Hey, just real quick, I'm getting ready to start watch because I've been jacking around with the clips. What did you think of the series on Chernobyl?
Well, we both have some experience with that. I was based in Moscow when Chernobyl happened. I was working there as New York Times bureau chief and during that period. And the series was good. I think, it was, historically not entirely accurate, but it certainly captured the main elements of the Chernobyl accident and its aftermath.
Of course, that Chernobyl occurred not under Khrushchev, about whom I wrote a biography, but under Gorbachev, about whom I wrote another biography.
You led me right to it. What about, and then Phil Taubman is a former New York Times Washington bureau chief. He is affiliated with Stanford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation. He is the author of In the Nation's Service, The Life and Times of George P. Shultz. Is that where Ambassador or Secretary Rice is?
Yeah, she is currently director of the Hoover Institution, which is at Stanford University.
I got to meet her last year because I did the public relations for a tribute to Richard Lugar and got to meet her. It was one of my absolute favorite honors, for lack of a better term. Just real quick before we move on, I hate to call you a couple of Cold Warriors, but do the Cold Warriors get together? Do you guys stay in touch with some of the other people who were serving and writing during that time and talk about how much the world's changed?
We don't think of ourselves as Cold Warriors. I mean, we were often critical of the way the
Right.
United States was conducting the Cold War. One of my friends and colleagues as a historian and also a biographer is John Gaddis, John Lewis Gaddis,
Oh, yeah.
who wrote Kennan's biography. And I mean, he's a pretty tough guy. He even concluded that the presence of nuclear weapons kept the peace. He was not an anti-nuclear guy. But as I say, we think of ourselves scholars as objectively describing what happened rather than rooting for one side or the other.
But it's certainly true that our careers are immersed in writing about the Cold War. Bill was a student of the Soviet Union, became an expert about it. I covered the Soviet Union. I covered the Cold War from Washington and Moscow. I've written books about the Cold War. So you're right in the sense that our careers have revolved around the Cold War.
I should mention a previous guest. He's actually come on twice. He wrote to discuss two of his terrific books. Is Michael Dodds.
Yeah, Michael is a wonderful guy. I've tried to provide him with some information to help him on a couple of projects where I had done some original reporting. Yeah, it's, I think that younger generations look back at the Cold War and may be mystified about it, but those of us who lived through it, can't shake it.
Yeah. And I'm like I said, I was born in '67, so I remember the end of it and how it dominated the news, dominated what you did at school. It's a fascinating time period. The particular reason I bring it up is because many describe the Cuban Missile Crisis as the most terrifying moment of the Cold War. You can weigh in on that, but I specifically wanted to ask both of you about McNamara's role, his behavior in ensuring the peaceful outcome for which we are all thankful.
Well, I would say that McNamara played that role indeed. He was the one who argued along with Bobby Kennedy for a blockade of Cuba rather than an attack on the missile sites and an invasion of Cuba. He was the one who had a crucial moment when Russian submarines approached the line in the sea that we had drawn as a place where they must stop and not continue to Cuba with their load of missiles. And he put an admiral in his place who tried to tell him that he was going to just follow naval regulations. And McNamara said, "The hell with John Paul Jones. You listen to me and do what the president and I want you to do." But as Phil,
That is a great line. I have
yeah,
to give him credit. It's a great line.
but as Phil knows and maybe wants to talk about later in the crisis, I guess it was a Monday, whatever day it was, when we were waiting to hear from Khrushchev that he was indeed trying to end the crisis by agreeing to remove the missiles. It turned out that McNamara was busy preparing the invasion.
Yeah, so the historians go back and look at the transcripts and draw different conclusions from them, and there is a view, a perfectly intellectually sound view that McNamara began the crisis in a mode of a dove and ended it as a hawk, leaning on Kennedy, recommending at that point that we, before Khrushchev blinked, that we should invade. My interpretation and Bill's interpretation, looking at the transcripts of all those conversations, which were recorded, is that in that role, he did do that, but he did it because that's the job of the Secretary of Defense. that you prepare plans, contingency plans. In this case, they looked like they were going to go from contingency to reality. But, the president needs to know, if I say we're going to invade, are you ready? And so McNamara prepared the plans with the military brass, presented them to Kennedy, said, we can do this. And so I think, at the end of the crisis, some people look at him and say he's now advocating an invasion. I think our view was he was saying, here's how we could conduct the invasion.
Part of being Secretary of Defense, as written in your book, and quite frankly others, is getting along with your boss, the president, while at the same time making sure that the multi-star generals and admirals at the Pentagon follow the president's policies. How did McNamara's tussles with these 4 stars during the Cuban Missile Crisis, how did that help him or hurt him in his relationship with many of these same generals as the Vietnam War gets started?
Bill, do you want to field that? Go ahead.
Well, I think he had already alienated many of these generals with his transformation of the Pentagon. So I think this was a further problem in their relationship. The man, I think, who was most upset with McNamara was General LeMay, who viewed Kennedy's policies in the Cuban Missile Crisis as appeasement, and even dared to say so at meetings of the executive committee. So there was that tension, and that continued in Vietnam because LeMay wanted to bomb Vietnam back to the Stone Age, and the generals were thinking of invading North Vietnam. And yet McNamara was worried about that, as Phil mentioned earlier, because he was afraid that would lead China in, as China had come in Korea, and the Russians might be required to back China, even though they were arguing with China at that point. And so we might find ourselves in a nuclear war. That was McNamara's fear then, and really throughout his life. He eventually became a nuclear abolitionist, as Phil knows, having written a book about the former Cold Warriors who did fight for nuclear abolition.
I'm sorry. I help. Every time you mention Curtis, all I can do is think of George C. Scott. So just forgive me. Laughing at your reference, I'm chuckling.
You're breaking up a bit.
Why don't you go ahead, Phil, and just because you seem to be fine.
No, but I'm not sure he can hear us anymore. He's frozen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he lost his internet, went down. Let's see if he can get back.
Good to go.
Okay.
You guys okay?
Yeah, we're here. You faded out.
I did, and my Wi-Fi is working, so I'm not sure why, but let me make sure we're recording. Okay, we are. A few minutes ago, you mentioned the assassination, November 22nd, 1963. Much of the debate about what ifs, the counterfactuals involve Kennedy and Vietnam. What would he have done as opposed to President Johnson? That's obviously an entire podcast in and of itself. However, did McNamara change his tack, his personality, his advice, his manner, as opposed when going from Kennedy to Johnson? Because obviously they're two entirely different men. Phil?
This is fascinating because in some ways McNamara was a chameleon, and that was apparent with Kennedy on the very issue of Vietnam. Early on in the Kennedy administration, McNamara came back from a visit to South Vietnam, and he assumed that Kennedy was going to be forward-leaning about Vietnam and made a presentation to Kennedy and Dean Rusk and the other senior advisors to that effect, and was clearly surprised when the president didn't embrace that and, in fact, raised some skepticism about whether we ought to get more deeply involved in Vietnam. And the comments that Kennedy made, which, are kind of memorable in retrospect, I'm going to paraphrase them. He said, but, we could send our boys there and the bands would play and then the boys would come back in body bags. And so Kennedy, having been in World War II and having been attacked, the PT boat, history, he was wary of war. And as soon as McNamara heard that sentiment from the president, he did an about flip in that same meeting. And so there's the chameleon. On one hand, he's for escalation to some extent. On the other hand, he's suddenly against it. And we have a figure in the book that we quote, Eugene Zuckert, who was at business school with McNamara and later served under him as Air Force Secretary, who has this devastating comment about McNamara. I'm going to let Bill use the words because I think he's got them on the tip of his tongue in a more immediate way than I do.
Yes, as Zuckert was quoted, and we quote Zuckert in the book, as saying, McNamara was never more committed to a position than when the boss required him to support a position that McNamara himself did not want. In other words, McNamara was never more committed than when the boss told him to take a position that McNamara himself rejected.
And so then to pick up, I think one of the patterns you see, which we've just described with Kennedy, recurs in an even more intense form under Johnson. And there are many explanations or theories, I guess I would say, of why McNamara behaved the way he did under Johnson, prosecuting the war, being a cheerleader for the war in public. But one of them clearly was a sense of wanting to please the boss. And he sensed from the get-go, almost within days of the assassination, that Johnson wanted to prosecute a war in Southeast Asia. And he delivered to Johnson what he thought Johnson wanted.
So there was no attempt by, let's just leave it to McNamara, Secretary of Defense McNamara. There was no attempt in this stage of the 60s, in this era, to talk him out of it. President Kennedy didn't want to do this. We should probably do the same thing as President Kennedy, which I obviously know the friction between Johnson and Robert Kennedy, especially, but John a bit. Johnson hadn't been elected yet, so he wasn't really sure if he had the people's backing. It would be, obviously different after 64 when he crushes Goldwater. But is in the early years before the big troop commitments in 65, are there any heroes in the government who are trying to say, we don't want any part of this?
I don't think so. We can report that the CIA in general was more skeptical about Vietnam than the military, than the army. But we didn't try to follow exactly what the CIA was saying to Johnson. I know that Johnson greatly resented the way the Kennedys had treated him. So for McNamara to have gone to Johnson and say, well, look, Kennedy wanted to get out, that would not have helped at all, because the last thing Johnson wanted to do was to take his cue from the Kennedys, who had tried to keep him undercover and really out of the mainstream of their discussions.
Phil?
Yeah, there's this incident that we describe in the book that's really telling, which is, again, not long after the assassination, Johnson is talking to his senior, national security aides, and he actually berates McNamara for what McNamara and Kennedy had been talking about before the assassination, which was this idea that maybe we should end our involvement in Vietnam rather than escalating it. And in a classic kind of Johnsonian mode, he's rather sharp with McNamara about, what the hell were you guys doing at that point? And I think that was a signal to McNamara that Johnson wants us to stand firm in Vietnam, wants us to defend South Vietnam. And it was almost like an opening salvo that set the tone for what followed.
Before we get into the meat of the war, of the conduct of the war, is there anything else that either of you would like to bring up to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience? Am I missing something that's going to help the audience sort of understand McNamara's decisions and behavior?
Well, I might say that for 10 years at Amherst College, I taught a course with a professor of psychology on personality and political leadership. And although I'm not a psychiatrist or even a psychologist, I learned to look for, beneath the surface to try to figure people out. And what I discovered in the course of our research on this book, from reading Robert Caro's so far 4-volume biography of Johnson, from reading Lady Bird Johnson's memoirs and diary and other things, is that Johnson himself was deeply torn about the war and had a tendency to be depressed. It turned out that periodically in his life, he would take to his bed and cover his head with his blankets and his pillow and not emerge until Lady Bird talked him out of it and got him to resume his job. And I think one of the reasons Johnson was depressed in Vietnam was that he knew what a mess it was, and he was far from sure that the United States could prevail. But on the other hand, he didn't want to lose Vietnam, lest he be attacked by right-wing politicians for doing that. So if you understand Johnson in this way, as I've described him, I think it helps you to understand why he was so determined to keep McNamara on, which he was. He talked to his wife about how he couldn't sleep when McNamara was away in Vietnam, for example. He flattered McNamara endlessly. There would be these occasions when McNamara would be grilling hamburgers for lunch for his family, and the phone would ring, and it would be Johnson saying, "Come on over to the White House. Let's have lunch." And they would drop everything and go over there. I guess what I'm trying to explain is how Johnson's dependence on McNamara grew up and deepened, and how McNamara felt that whatever else was going on, he had to stay in office in order to help a president who was himself fragile and vulnerable. And so this explains, in part, perhaps, why McNamara doesn't do what I think you mentioned before, Robert, which is to say, look, this war's no good, we should get out, which is what he really wanted to say, but he could never bring himself to say.
Phil?
No, I think Bill's accurately described it. But and the one thing I would add is, as one thinks through the events that unfurled while Johnson was president, the Vietnam events that evolved, I think they flow out to a considerable extent out of a notion in Johnson's mind, which is, I'm not going to be the first president of the United States to lose a war. And that weighed heavily on him. He talks about that. And of course, the paradox or the cruel irony is that the deeper he got into Vietnam, the more the idea of defeat looked like a nightmare. Had he come into office, been reelected by a landslide as he was in 1964, and had he said at that point, this fight's not worth waging, we're pulling out, I don't think he would have been tagged as losing a war. But the deeper in he got, the more, by early 1966, we've got tens of thousands of combat troops in Vietnam. Now there is a war actually to lose. And I think that drove him throughout his presidency to keep waging that war.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guests are Philip and William Taubman. They wrote a book. It's called McNamara at War, A New History. Has a haunting photo on the front cover, which I'll ask you about here in a second. Is it fair to describe Vietnam as a war and effort built on lies, built on specific lies that were fed to the American people either through politics or by the military? And of course, I'm referencing the Gulf of Tonkin incident. How did McNamara use that incident to further the president's aims? Or is that too harsh?
Well, let me suggest the following. I'd be happy to come back and talk in detail about the incident and what they knew and didn't know. But I think it would be helpful if Bill first described the ideological and geopolitical landscape in which these guys were operating, because that's an important answer to your question, too.
You've anticipated one of my prison questions. So I have 3 prison questions, and I'll just ask them real quick. The geopolitical prison, the domestic political prison, and the economic prosperity prison, in which Lyndon Johnson was either in, and McNamara thought he was in, or that Johnson was actually in and restricted his ability to make the needed decisions. Bill Taubman, go ahead, though, please.
Well, let's see. The geopolitical prism was essentially the domino theory, which was that if the United States were to lose the war in Vietnam, all of Southeast Asia would fall. And if all of Southeast Asia fell, then Japan would fall. And if Japan fell, then the repercussions would be felt in the Middle East, in Turkey and Greece. Communism would gain. And if all of that happened, Europe would feel isolated and might itself be threatened by left-wing forces. This was the domino theory. And in fact, one of the things we cite in the book is that at one point, when the decision makers in the White House were making decisions, George Ball I think it's Clark Clifford, in July 1965. Johnson is at Camp David with McNamara and Clifford. They've been previously in Washington. And Clifford says of McNamara, he says, "I never heard the domino theory expressed with as greater extreme than McNamara did." So McNamara was the primary and most vehement exponent of the domino theory. And I think that's one reason why he shrank from telling Johnson to get out of Vietnam, because he half believed it himself. And his colleagues 100% believed it. And he was afraid that to the extent that he wanted to get out, he might actually be wrong in adopting that view, since all the people around him, none of them shared it. Okay,
Just real quick, as a historian, how true, accurate, or right do you rate the domino theory? Because you're right. I mean, it dominates everything. The domino theory in this time period, I mean, it's Eisenhower who sorts of propagates it, right, in the 50s. But just looking back as a historian, how much credibility do you give this theory?
Well, we can look at what happened. We did lose in Vietnam. We did get out, and the world and the sky did not crumble. The rest of the countries in Southeast Asia, they had troubles. Some of them needed needed aid, whether military or not. Japan did not fall. Turkey and Greece did not fall. Africa did not fall as a whole. Europe remained strong. The domino theory was an exaggeration, which unfortunately our leaders bought into. It was a kind of lie, except that it's not the kind of lie where they knew the truth and were offering the domino theory as a geopolitical ideological cover. They believed in it. Anyway, that was the first. What was the second one, Robert?
Political prison, domestic political prison.
Yeah. Well, I think I mentioned this before. There was this feeling on the part of Johnson and others that if they lost in Vietnam, they would be chastised by the right wing in the United States for having lost Vietnam, not by the left. I mean, even at a time when the anti-war feeling was growing on the left, what they were afraid of most of all was the right. And this was a widely spread view. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how legitimate is it for a country like the United States to wage war in which thousands or even millions are dying because it has this fear that if it doesn't, there'll be trouble at home. Just think about that. That is not really a legitimate reason for killing.
And Johnson waged the war vigorously, and 66 turned out badly for him. And then obviously 68, his vice president loses to Nixon. The last prison is domestic. He's got the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. He has all this stuff he wants to do, Medicare, Medicaid. And
yes.
is he afraid that McNamara and Johnson, are they afraid there's just not going to be enough money for both?
Yes, and in fact, this is a very important reason why McNamara stays to the end, to 68, because he believes in Johnson's mission, as Johnson himself defines it: civil rights legislation, war on poverty. McNamara, although he was thought by Kennedy to have been a Republican, actually he was not. He was a Roosevelt Democrat. And one of the things he loved about Johnson was that Johnson was doing this work of liberal legislation, which he believed in. That's very important.
Phil Taubman, tell us about the Gulf of Tonkin incident / resolution, and how that's, I think the incident's in, is it September of 64?
August, I think September.
August.
Yeah. And those who are not familiar with it, it was essentially the Congressional Declaration of War. It wasn't exactly a declaration of war, but it was the overwhelming vote, just a handful of dissenters in the House and Senate, empowering the president to defend American interests and American forces in the Vietnam area, at sea and of course on land, and it was taken by Johnson as a vote both of confidence in what he was doing, but also as a vote indicating that the Congress was almost, universally behind him on whatever he was going to do in Vietnam. But it was an incident that led to this resolution, which either nothing took place and they imagined it entirely, or more likely there was a minor incident in the sea off the North Vietnamese coast that led to Johnson seeking the resolution. So when you go back and unpack exactly what happened, and you can do it because all the documents involved in the Gulf of Tonkin have been declassified, what you see, first of all, is that the unprovoked attack on American naval forces in the Gulf of Tonkin, which Johnson and McNamara just talked about to the American people at the time, was actually provoked. It was provoked by covert operations supported by the United States, conducted by South Vietnamese forces, in which those forces fired upon, attacked various facilities along the North Vietnamese coast. So the first shots, if there were multiple shots from both sides fired in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the first were fired by the South Vietnamese at the behest of the United States. The incident that became famous was the belief by the American naval forces in the Gulf that they were coming under attack by North Vietnam. And there were reportedly 2 attacks. And when you go back and look at it, it turns out that the sonar data on which the attack descriptions were based is dicey, to say the least. And it may well have been that the sonar men were panicked by signals, misinterpreted what they were seeing. And so in the end, the commander, the American naval commander out there, sent word back to the Pentagon and back to the White House that he wasn't entirely sure what had happened. But that didn't stop Johnson and McNamara from going to Congress to seek what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And it's an interesting footnote that one of the individuals who had a kind of ringside seat for the communications that were moving back and forth from Washington through Hawaii to the naval forces in the Gulf of Tonkin was a young man named Daniel Ellsberg. And it was actually Daniel Ellsberg who was the first civilian at the Pentagon to see these communications, these cables. And when he watched what transpired over the next few days that led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, he was dumbfounded because he basically, as he said in the book that he did, I could see that the president and the Secretary of Defense were essentially misrepresenting what had happened so that they could get this almost unanimous resolution through Congress.
And Johnson, who seems to have spent most of his life seeking some sort of validation, got the validation he wanted, as you mentioned it a few minutes ago, overwhelmingly passed Congress, both houses of Congress, to give Johnson sort of the authorization, if that's the right term, to use the force he deemed necessary. A few months later, Johnson, I think it's 61% of the popular vote. I mean, an enormous landslide over Goldwater. So now Johnson / McNamara have all the power, all the validation, all the sorts of credibility and power they need. But in between the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and sort of American military effort in Vietnam, advisors, and then the Air Force, I'm going to get very quickly to the point, and that is from, let's say, Johnson's reelection in November of 64 to the spring and summer of 65. To me, that's the meat of your book. That's the part of your guys' book that I enjoyed so much. That process, that discussion. So, how does the United States move from advisors and airstrikes to combat troops in Vietnam, which completely changes everything? And do I have my history right on that? Are there anything you need to correct?
Yeah, no, well, I think our feeling is those were vitally important years. The crucible year of decision making was 65.
Mm-hmm.
And in early 65, McNamara and McGeorge Bundy drafted what became known as the Fork in the Road memo to Johnson. He's now been elected president, and they're basically saying to him, we can't go on as we are. We're kind of treading water over there. We're not winning. We're not losing. It's kind of a stalemate. We've either got to, think seriously about getting out, or we've got to, think seriously about taking the initiative militarily. They prepare the memo, and they both favor getting more actively engaged militarily. Not long after that, McGeorge Bundy is in South Vietnam on a visit, and near where he is based comes under attack by North Vietnamese forces. And it's a rout, basically, of the South Vietnamese. And that leads to an almost panicked reaction by Johnson and McNamara. And that is the moment when they start the air war against North Vietnam. So basically, early 65 is kind of the beginning of the escalation, and then it reaches a crescendo in the summer when they convene at Camp David and at the White House, and they decide to go from having advisors in Vietnam, military troops who are called advisors, they're non-combatants, to sending tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of American combat troops to Vietnam. And so from the Fork in the Road memo and the launch of the air war, those first 6 to 8 months of 65 are the pivot point. And we are now fully engaged in an American war in Vietnam.
Bill Taubman, would you like to expand a little bit on your brother's comments and also talk for just a minute about how Johnson or McNamara through Johnson or Johnson through McNamara sold the change in policy to the American people?
Well, the first thing I would add, Phil mentioned the moment when McGeorge Bundy was in Vietnam, and the base near where he was attacked, the Americans concluded that this was a crucial signal that the North Vietnamese were attacking while Bundy was there, and that showed they were going for broke. Actually, it turns out that the attack on that base at Pleiku was launched by people who did not realize that Bundy was in Vietnam. So that's an example of a misperception, a misunderstanding. And later on in life, in the 90s, McNamara ends up going to Vietnam as part of a critical oral history study. And at this meeting, he encounters General, I forget his name, the leading general,
Yeah.
Giap, and other Vietnamese who explained to him, for example, that the attack on Pleiku was made not because Bundy was there, but without realizing that Bundy was there. So that's a very important addition, I think, to the story that Phil tells. Now, once the decision is made in July to send in ground troops, it's a new situation. Because in 64, and this is important to understand, the reason that we were not escalating and we were sort of waiting and waiting was that Johnson was running for president.
Mm.
He wanted to present himself as a wise man, a man of restraint, as compared with Barry Goldwater, who was a warmonger. So Johnson had kept a lid on the war throughout 64, and then was expanding it in 65. And of course, the way they talked about the war in 65 differed from 64 because now they were intent on getting backing of the American people for a much wider war, whereas in 64, they'd been trying to present themselves as virtual peacemakers.
So,
And back. Go
Robert,
ahead. Go ahead.
just to continue on this vein we're dealing with here, Johnson was deceptive to the American people, with the American people about what they were doing, because he was, as you stated not long ago, he had these domestic priorities, and he was worried that taking the country to war would distract not just attention, but even more importantly, would distract resources, money, etc. And so he was determined to play down what they were doing. And this led to interesting conversations between McNamara and Johnson about how open they should be, and in particular, going back to McNamara as the numbers guy. McNamara is looking at what's going on, and he's saying, it's going to cost a lot of money. We're going to need a tax increase. And Johnson wanted nothing to do with that. That was the last thing he wanted, was to go to Congress and request a tax increase for a war half a world away. And so there's a rather sharp exchange, actually, between the two of them, where he's McNamara saying, I think, we better, talk to the congressional leadership about this and see if there's sentiment to do something about this, and call up the reserves, which was another thing that
Right.
McNamara advocated. But of course, if you call up the reserves, that's going to create huge headlines about mobilization, and it's also going to make clear there's a vast amount of money that's going to be expended. So Johnson says to McNamara, well, if you think we need to go to Congress and talk about money, why don't you go up there and talk to them and tell me what the sentiment is up there. And McNamara talks about, well, he'll go up, and basically Johnson says to him, you don't know a goddamn thing about the Congress. And so I think a lot of people have forgotten that one of the reasons that LBJ ended up not running for re-election in 68, it wasn't just the opposition to the war, it was the reality that Americans came to realize he was misleading them about the war, the credibility gap, it was called.
Leaving aside the Vietnamese people, in your book, I was fascinated with how you discussed it, and then I mentioned the brilliant Brian Vandermark earlier. The Vietnam people, put them aside. Has any government in the history of the United States been less worthy of our aid and blood treasure than the South Vietnamese government in the 60s? That's a softball for you there, Bill Taubman. Just I put it on the tee for you.
Well, I'm thinking, I'm thinking back. Traditionally, the United States has supported governments that were corrupt or right wing or autocratic. There's plenty of that. I don't know whether the Shah's government in Iran was all that worthy of our support. I don't know whether, at least in the beginning, before a growing emphasis on democratization, the government of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, was that worthy of our support? I'm just thinking back over other places. The the Dominican Republic. I'm not an expert on all this. So I'm really just improvising, but my sense is that over and over we have supported governments which we actually would have had plenty of reason not to like.
But
McNamara, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, look back on Vietnam though for a second. It's interesting. I return to it because the McNaughton diary is full of discussions between McNamara and McNaughton about the corruption of the South Vietnamese government, about the fact that the South Vietnamese government didn't command the support of the South Vietnamese people, and in fact, as they're looking for exit strategies from Vietnam to prepare to present to the president. There are a number of days in the McNaughton diary where he very explicitly talks about thinking, well, the state of the South Vietnamese government is so rotten that maybe we can use that as a pretext to say, we're not going to stick around and expend our blood and treasury over here to support this hopelessly corrupt and unpopular government. And so that was a recognition that McNamara and McNaughton had, but Johnson would never accept that as essentially an potentially explanatory reason for pulling out of Vietnam.
Do you think it would have worked? Either one of you think that would have worked on the American people?
I don't. It certainly wouldn't have worked in the '64 campaign atmosphere. That's so politically charged, and Goldwater came across as a guy who was going to fight whatever war we needed to protect American interests. But I think after the election, with the mandate that Johnson had, they might well have been able to make an explanation that would have potentially kept enough people in line with them that it wouldn't have pulled the rug out from them politically.
Professor Taubman, describe a little bit, talk for a minute, please, about McNamara's relationship with Westmoreland, who was at the beginning, overall commander in Vietnam. How did they manage a relationship while also trying to manage this war?
Well, I think there were sort of built-in structural strains between them, in the sense that Westmoreland's task was to fight the war and, if possible, win it. And McNamara's attitude was the war probably can't be won. So and we know that later on after 65 and 66, Westmoreland was coming in with requests for many more troops, hundreds of thousands. McNamara was resistant and trying to say, no, that's too many. So there were stresses and strains. I think, on the other hand, I'm sure McNamara admired Westmoreland as a general who was trying his damn best under trying circumstances to do what he had been ordered to do. And perhaps that kind of respect lay behind an interesting decision of McNamara's later on, when Westmoreland sued CBS television and radio for charging that he, Westmoreland, had distorted the situation in Vietnam, and CBS had claimed that he had distorted it. Well, there was a trial, and McNamara was asked to testify, and he hadn't said a damn thing about Vietnam for almost 20 years. but he agreed to testify. And what he said was that Westmoreland was an honest man, and he had not distorted the true situation in Vietnam to McNamara or Johnson.
Do you believe that?
I don't believe it. I think McNamara was being a good friend to a man he had not been that friendly with. He didn't like the idea of being depicted himself as a man who had fallen for misinformation or disinformation, but he thought it was the honorable thing to do, to defend his colleague and partner in this war, in this judicial proceeding. And I admire him for that.
Agreed. Philip Taubman, is there 64 to me? It seems that the argument, or excuse me, 65, that's the time to get out. Between 65 and the end of McNamara's tenure as Secretary of Defense, 68, was there any other precipitous time like X has happened or Y isn't happening and this is our chance? Or did the machine just keep rolling?
No, the machine kept rolling. And as I say, he was looking for ways to de-escalate the war. As we describe in the book, he latched on to some diplomatic initiatives that looked as if they might lead the way to some kind of negotiation with the North Vietnamese. And he was making an effort to promote those despite the disdain of Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, who told McNamara at a White House meeting with Johnson about one of these initiatives. He basically said, Bob, you're wasting your time. And
It turns out he wouldn't have been wasting his time. Forgive me, but it turns out he would not have been wasting his time.
Yeah, McNamara thought it was worth putting some time in to see if these could be encouraged. And he asked Johnson, there he is sitting with the president and the Secretary of State, and he knows that diplomacy is the purview of the Secretary of State. So he turns to the president and he basically says, Mr. President, would you mind if I took the lead on this particular diplomatic initiative? And Johnson said, okay. And he did. It came to naught, partly because in the course of the initiative developing, which involved two Frenchmen who were well connected in Hanoi, and Henry Kissinger, who was at that point a young professor at Harvard, the whole thing came undone because while McNamara is encouraging them and trying to get Johnson to encourage them, Johnson is approving increased bombing of North Vietnam. And so the whole thing, of course, collapsed before it ever really got off the ground. Those are years of missed opportunities, I guess one could say. McNamara, and it was a missed opportunity for Johnson because he now had a Secretary of Defense who wanted to end the war, but he wouldn't really listen to him. And it was a missed opportunity because the Secretary of Defense who wanted to end the war didn't have the nerve to tell the president that's exactly what needed to be done. He never went into the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, this is a war we cannot win with the strategy pursuing. The only solution is to get out. And since we can't seem to get a negotiation underway to do that, let's just get out. He never did it.
Philip Taubman, you mentioned during the Cuban Missile Crisis how McNamara thought it was his, and this is a question for both of you, of course, Secretary of Defense, it's his job to make the plan, right? If we're going to invade Cuba, his job, whatever he thinks of the policy decision, operationally and logistically, he's got to come up with something for the President of the United States. Did McNamara ever actually write or formulate a plan for the United States to get out of Vietnam?
He did in 1963, before Kennedy was killed. He did put together a plan to withdraw, and Kennedy was killed before he had a chance to make a decision one way or the other on that plan. Once the war has massively escalated under Johnson, McNamara is poking around at the edges, but they never get far enough down the road of talking about ending the war to develop a full-scale plan of how to do that.
I
And
might
see, if I could just add, Nixon did escalate the war further. He took it into Cambodia, as we know, and he eventually drew down the American forces in Vietnam. But the war ended after he had resigned, and it ended. It was not the calamitous ending that we saw in Afghanistan just a few years ago, but it was pretty calamitous, and it's all captured in that one photograph of Vietnamese clambering up a ladder on the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, clinging to a helicopter that's about to take off.
I was just going to add, if I may, that if we focus on the period that Phil mentioned just before Kennedy's assassination, when he is talking about leaving, and they even announce not a withdrawal, but a reduction in American advisors, and they're planning to leave early in 1964. And as I think you said, Robert, there's been a lot of debate about what Kennedy would have done. But the point I'm trying to make is that Kennedy's own position was, this is a war we may not be able to win, but we must fight. That is, he was torn too. He saw the problems with winning. He saw the case for leaving, but he was afraid that if they left, especially before his election, he might not be elected. He might give it a try after his election in 1964, but even then, we're not sure he would have acted on it.
We mentioned a few times, and you discussed it in terrific terms, both here on the podcast and in the book. The 1964 election certainly was a watershed for Lyndon Johnson in many ways, foreign and domestic. Did the 1966 election, when the Republicans had a very good midterm result, did that change anyone's mind? Did it make any difference, any impact?
Well, I think the unpopularity of the war, which may have contributed to that midterm outcome, this grew and grew and grew. And over time, clearly the pressure on Johnson built. We know it led ultimately to his decision not to run for re-election. But it also had consequences directly with McNamara. And the more the war opposition grew, I think the more he felt pressure. We haven't talked much about the relationship with Jackie Kennedy. She was pressing him to end the war. There's a scene in our book where he's up at her apartment in Manhattan, and she's pounding him on the chest with her fists, pleading with him to end the war. She clearly thinks that he is a peacemaker. That's her perception of him, presumably because that's the way he's presented himself to her. At home, the McNamara family is riven because the children, three of them, particularly the son, the youngest, Craig, is opposed to the war. Even McNamara's wife, Margie, is opposed to the war. And because he's compartmentalized his life, he doesn't talk about his job when he goes home, even after the ghastly moment when a Quaker immolates himself outside the Pentagon below McNamara's window as a protest against the war. McNamara witnesses this ghastly scene and goes home that night and says not a word about it to his family. So, yes, I think I may not be answering the question in exactly the way you asked it, but I think it's clear, that the domestic political environment goes back to one of your three prisms, did have an impact on McNamara as time went on.
Bill?
Robert, you mentioned early in our discussion that the cover of our book contains a picture, I'm going to hold it up, of McNamara looking out the window at the Pentagon. This is not the moment when he's looking at the at the Quaker who is burning himself to death. This time he is looking out the window at a big anti-war demonstration in which students particularly are marching on the Pentagon trying to shut it down. And McNamara has organized a defense of the Pentagon with military troops with who may have guns, but they're not to use them. And in the end, the demonstrators turn back. And what's really interesting, this is a kind of way into McNamara's mind and the way it works. On the one hand, he's pleased that he has prevented a march on the Pentagon from getting anywhere near to shutting it down. But on the other hand, he says to somebody, if I had been in charge of that march, if I had been in charge of that demonstration, I would have shut down the Pentagon. So in other words, he is proud. He's imagining himself leading the anti-war demonstration and taking pride in his prowess as to how he would have shut down the Pentagon. I think that is a window into a complicated mind who's pulled in different ways by his various feelings.
There have been whole books, series of books, movies, documentaries ad nauseum about the year 1968. Some call it the worst year in American history. I wouldn't necessarily agree. I think 1861 is pretty bad, but we can all have our own opinions. But what was 1968? We'll start with you, Phil. What was 1968 like for Robert McNamara?
Well, it was the year he moved and took over the World Bank. But before he did that, literally in his last days in office, the Tet Offensive took place, which was this kind of caught the United States diplomats and military leadership in South Vietnam off guard. They had no anticipation that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had been able to organize themselves so effectively that they could start a multi-front surprise offensive. And, it fizzled out after a while, but it immediately symbolized the failure of the United States in Vietnam, that such a offensive could have taken place so effectively in the short term. So McNamara is exiting the Pentagon. He comes to work. I think it's his last day on the job, and Clark Clifford, who is going to succeed him as defense secretary, they're in the White House, and he's basically handing the keys over to Clifford, and he's basically saying, "Boy, this is a hell of a day." The Tet Offensive is either going on, or I'm not exactly sure what state it was in at that point, but the American warship had been seized, and there had been a nuclear weapons accident in Greenland. We all know that Trump now has his eye on Greenland. On that fateful day when McNamara left the Pentagon, a B-52, I think it was, or an airplane carrying nuclear weapons had crashed after takeoff, and a number of nuclear weapons, they didn't detonate, thank goodness, had fallen into the sea, and the United States was desperately trying to recover them. For McNamara, the beginning of 68 was a kind of jumble. And then he moves over to the World Bank and takes command there. And Bill can talk a little bit about that. But what I would add is that as he transitions to the World Bank, his relationship with Jackie Kennedy continues. And it's actually at the World Bank that he goes to, I think it's the commissioning of the JFK aircraft carrier, and delivers a very moving speech that is basically patterned on the Pericles funeral oration. That is an ode to JFK and to Jackie Kennedy, who's present at this ceremony in Norfolk News, I guess. And she goes back to her mother's place in Rhode Island that night, and at 1 a.m. pens a letter to him that is her most intense expression of affection for Robert McNamara.
I think it's also worth talking about the moment when Johnson pays tribute to McNamara at the White House and talks about him as a wonderful Secretary of Defense and awards him, I think it's called the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest American civilian medal. And then McNamara steps to the lectern and starts to talk and can't continue. He can't say a word except, I'll have to come back to this sometime in the future. And it doesn't take much imagination to imagine what's going through his head at that point. On the one hand, pride that he has risen to this height as the Secretary of Defense and is now being awarded this medal and being paid tribute to by the President of the United States. On the one hand, pride. On the one hand, anguish and torment about what he has done in that role. I'm going to say on the third hand, affection and respect for President Johnson, for all he's done to fight poverty in the United States and for all the civil rights legislation he's passed. On the other hand, anger at President Johnson for continuing to insist on fighting the war that McNamara has decided is unwinnable. So all of these things, if I'm right, are swirling through his head, and what emerges therefore is silence. And later on in life, I think it's in his memoirs, Phil, you can confirm this. I think he talks about what he would have said or should have said on this day had he been able to speak. And what he writes down is that kind of mixture, that Johnson was tough and mean and difficult and awful. Those are not the words he's using, paraphrasing, but also worthy of respect and affection, and might even have loved him as a man who had done so much for the United States. Phil, can I add on that?
Go ahead, Phil.
No, that's right. When you look at the words that he drafted for his book and says he would have delivered, one of the adjectives he used about Johnson is cruel. And I don't believe for a second he ever would have delivered those words in the presence of the president.
Absolutely agree with you on that. One more question before we get to the 5 questions we've asked everybody. So I hope I'll try to make it quick so that we can, you've been very, very kind with your time. You are, this question to both of you, we'll go with Phil first. You are McNamara's best friend in the early 90s. He says, you know what? I've been silent mostly, but it's time. I'm going to write a book. What advice would you have given him?
Well, I think probably the advice that his editor, Peter Osnos, did give him, which was, first of all, the book that Robert McNamara wanted to write was an autobiography, a full autobiography. And Peter said, no, you need to write a book about your leadership of the Vietnam War. And I think Peter also advised him to be dead honest about what had happened and to come to grips with his own mistakes and to be candid about his failures. And he did that up to a considerable extent in that book. He stopped short, as you said early on, Robert, of apologizing for the war. He couldn't bring himself to do that. But he did look himself in the mirror in terms of the policy. The fault that I think the book has, and I don't think I would have been perspicacious enough to give this advice to him at the time, had I been his editor, would have been, okay, you not only have to look at the policy failures and military failures in Vietnam, you have to look at your own character failures. And that he did not do to any great extent.
Well, actually, I think I disagree here with my brother.
Okay.
I think I would have urged him to write the autobiography, because I've learned, as somebody who's written 2 biographies of Khrushchev and Gorbachev, that you can't understand the man in his maturity without understanding his childhood and what follows therefrom. You have to study the evolution of a whole life. So I would have loved a book in which he talked about his mother and his father and his girlfriends, and his evolution from Berkeley to Harvard Business School to the military to the Ford Motor Company to the World Bank. But that's just my way of approaching things.
But Bill, if he'd written that book, then we wouldn't have had a book to write.
He took the question right away from me, actually. I would have said, damn it, if you didn't have that, I never would have met you two.
He never would have told it the way we've told it, though.
I'm sure. Yeah, I agree.
We've reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. They've been answered by people such as Leon Panetta and, I should say, Larry Zonka.
All right.
And Clint Hill. I don't know if you two ever met Clint.
Yeah, yes. No, we know who he was.
Yeah, he came on the podcast and was absolutely fabulous.
Great.
Number 1, we're going to do in young to old to answer the question. So in that order. Phil, what was your first job?
My first job was first paid job was as a correspondent for Time magazine in New England.
Bill?
My first job was as an instructor at Amherst College beginning in 1967.
What was your first, Phil, what was your first concert?
We had the benefit of having a father who was a music critic of the New York Times. And so we were concert goers at a very early age. Indeed, one could sort of argue that my first concert was a performance at Tanglewood by the Boston Symphony on the day I was born, which kept my father away from the hospital at the time of my birth. But the first concert I remember was when I was probably 5 years old, going to a performance of Aida at the Metropolitan Opera.
My first concert, I'm pretty sure, was at Tanglewood in the summer of 1950 when my father was writing a book about the conductor Arturo Toscanini and writing reviews of concerts at Tanglewood of the Boston Symphony. I went to a lot of them. I guess I trace back my interest in classical music to that, but at the time I was probably bored silly.
Phil, if you could remember, Phil, I'll just say very, very quickly, one of my podcast guests, Helena Rubenhold, she wrote a fabulous book on British history, but I talked to her about her book on the Romanovs. She wrote a book about saving the Romanovs, which I'm fascinated by that particular subject. And I asked her, what was your first concert? And she sheepishly kind of said, well, I don't know if I should say. And I said, my God, who could it have been? And she saw the Beatles in a pub in 1962.
Wow.
Shameful.
Yeah, she just goes, we heard about this band and that they were popular and thought, what the hell, we'll go see them. And it was them. Number 3, if you suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend, Phil?
Sorry?
Phil, which book would you recommend? Any book in the world?
The Robert Caro book, The Master Builder, I think it was called, about Robert Moses. I may have the title wrong. It's one of his early books. It's a typical Robert Caro book that is deeply, deeply reported. And it's about how Robert Moses changed the physical face of New York by building highways and bridges, and in the process changed the life of the city and divided neighborhoods. It's an extraordinary story of how the willpower of one man can change an entire city.
The name that comes to my mind is Machiavelli, the prince. Machiavelli was an advisor to Italian princes, and he was trying to help them survive, but also promote the welfare of Italy. But in a way that the term Machiavellian has become so famous, he was willing to use almost any means to do so and to defend the use of any means, no matter how unpleasant, if necessary, to achieve his aims. And as a professor of political science at Amherst, the book that I remember most reading and teaching was that book, because it offered insight, I'm afraid, into the way the world works, not only then, but today.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose? Philip?
That's hard. Well, I'd not put my finger on an event, so I'm not going to answer it precisely in the way it was asked. I think the period in history that I would most want to have witnessed and lived through was the Pericles period in ancient Greece, in Athens, and the flowering of democracy in Athens at that point.
My graduate school history professor called it the greatest government in the world.
The event that occurs to me, I wouldn't want to have witnessed in person, because if I had, I would probably be dead. But because of its importance in the history of the world, it would have been the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki.
And you would defend those decisions?
I am frankly not sure. I know that thousands of American soldiers would have been killed if they'd had to invade Japan in the absence of those bombs being dropped, if they had to invade and to win the war in the old-fashioned way. And that's horrendous. But on the other hand, equally horrendous is the dropping of that bomb and the killing, the sort of burning and boiling of all those innocent Japanese. I guess that's the way the world works. Especially in war, you have to choose between the bad and the worse. Yeah. I don't know which is worse.
And that's, I just had Richard Frank on the podcast a couple of weeks ago discussing that topic and the downfall of the Japanese Empire. It wasn't a fair question to ask you just off the cuff like that. But yeah, the bad or the worst. And you just mentioned Machiavelli, and certainly the Americans and the Japanese and others have chosen sides on whether it was the right thing to do. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose? And you can choose each other if you want. Bill?
I think probably I never met. I admire, but I don't in a kind of blind way. But to me, probably the most interesting person I would like to have dinner with is Barack Obama.
Again, I'm drawn toward bad guys. They do so much damage, and because I try to understand them. So I find myself torn between 2 hours with Putin, who is, after all, the president of the country I've studied most in my career. And on the other hand, the other choice is Trump, who I fear is building up to being, if not as bad as Putin, at least terribly damaging to the United States.
Bill, you have a dark side I was unaware of.
Well, if you guys get together for Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever in the coming months, give you all something to talk about. I will say that I've asked, this will be my 342nd podcast interview.
Yes.
And I've asked the dinner question from the very beginning, and Barack Obama is the most given answer by far.
Interesting.
Make no judgment, but it's the most given by far.
Mm-hmm.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guests today, first time I've had brothers on, as I recall, Philip and William Taubman. Their book, McNamara At War, A New History. I read it as quickly as I could. I couldn't put it down. There's so much insight. And I hate to say it, it's just, and maybe I'm sure this wasn't the intent. It is just sad.
Yeah.
These are the things we have to study. Philip, Phil and Bill, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for
inviting us.
Enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, immensely.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.